If you made it through the last episode, get yourself a cookie and a cup of tea. Well done. A pat on the back. There was a lot of classes that we made. We're still getting used to this framework that we're going to build our application on. The more we work with it, the more it's going to make sense how they connect with each other. And the good news is that that's kind of like the basis. We're really getting close to having the core of this application. In this episode, we're just creating one more class. This is going to be our prefab generator. So in our asset generator folder, I'm going to go ahead and create a mesh prefab generator. Now this is going to be the generator for our stars, our star meshes, as well as our constellation meshes. You know, the lines that connect the stars together. Okay, so let's go ahead and make it. We'll say this is going to use Unity engine. This is going to be a public class called mesh prefab generator. It's going to inherit from asset generator. It's going to implement our protected function, generate assets. And we're going to need to know, we're going to need to have access to a mesh generator, because we need to know where this mesh generator is saving its meshes to. Okay, so for example, we have our mesh generator, which will, because it inherits from asset generator, it's got a folder path. So we're going to need to know where that folder path is. So let's go ahead and have a public mesh generator, star mesh generator. Okay, so that's going to give us a path to the saved meshes. Okay, so at the moment there's only one mesh in that folder, but there could be more. Like, let's say, yeah, I won't go into the details, but let's just pretend that there'll be more, and we'll find out later. So we're going to need to have a parent prefab that's going to, all our mesh prefabs will go inside of. So let's go ahead and create a parent prefab equals new GameObject. We want to give it a name. It makes things so much easier if things have names. So I'm going to create a public string prefab name. By default, I'll just call it mesh prefab. But that'll be, you can edit, you'll be able to change that. Like, for example, we might change it to star mesh prefab or constellation mesh prefab. So prefab name. All right. Now, so for each mesh inside this mesh path, we're going to want to create a prefab for it. So first of all, let's get all the meshes out this path. How are we going to do this? We're going to create a generic function. If you haven't used generic functions before, they're really useful when used sensibly. You know, so this is where you create a function for different types. For example, at the moment, we want to be able to load every mesh that's at a certain path. But maybe later down the track, we want to load every game object that's down at a path. And we can use the same function that'll do both things. I'm going to open up my asset utility, and we'll have a look at what this is going to look like. Okay, so this is going to be, if you haven't seen a syntax before, it's a bit of getting used to, but you sort of start to get the hang of it once you use it. Okay, so this will be a public static t. Whoa. No, it's an array of t's rather, and it's going to be GetAssetsPath. All right. Now, what we're going to say is you can specify what type it is that we're going to be returning. Okay, so we'll have a string folder name, folder path rather, and now we're also going to say whatever type it is, it's got to be a Unity object, which means you can specify what assets to return. But if you say like that type was like an integer, then the compiler will say no, this is only for creating Unity objects. So that's what this bit here says. All right. Now, first of all, we're gonna use this GetAssetPath function. GetAssetPath. So we say return GetAssetPaths. Pass in the folder path. All right. And then once we have those asset paths, we're gonna, for each of them, we're gonna load an asset. So dot select, that's going to be a path asset database, which in fact has its own, let's see, load asset at path has its own generic function where we can pass in that type and the path. And we'll change that to an array. All right, I'll just backtrack a bit, see what's going on here. So Unity has their own generic function, which would look a bit similar to what this is, right? Where it says load asset at path, and whatever type you pass in there, that's the type that's going to be returned to you. So this will be an array of meshes or an array of game objects. So now we can say, we can have our meshes. So we can say asset utility dot load, what was it? So get assets at path, pass in the folder path. And we're going to specify that we want only the meshes. So for example, if you had a folder that had meshes and game objects in it, it'll only return the meshes, which means it's a very robust way of doing this thing. Okay, so now that we have our meshes, we need to turn those into game objects. So let's go ahead and create a game object for each of them. So we'll have a game object, create mesh game object. We're going to pass in that mesh, and we're also going to pass in the parent. Mesh, and the parent. All right, so we're going to create a game object which will hold that mesh inside it, and it'll also have a mesh renderer where we can specify what type of material we want it to use. Okay, so we say var go equals new game object. We can give it the same name as the mesh's name. We're going to set its parent, go.transform.parent equals parent. And we're also going to give it a mesh filter and a mesh renderer. Okay, so we'll say go.addComponent mesh filter. All right, and this function return, this is just a little shorthand. This will return that mesh filter, and then we can set the mesh of it. .mesh equals mesh. We're also going to need a mesh renderer. So go.addComponent mesh renderer, and we're going to want to set the material of this renderer. And so let's create a new public variable, material. And so now we can set for each of these meshes that we're procedurally creating, we'll set what material it'll use. Equals material. All right, and then we can return that game object. In fact, we don't really need to. This is like a bit strange. Okay, so because we've got our parent prefab, right? That's a game object that Unity has created in memory. So it's not saved yet. It's created in memory rather than storage. So what we need to do is we need to create a game object and set this game object, this parent, as its parent. All right, it's a bit Dr. Seuss. Okay, so you have your parent game object, and then you're going to create a child game object for each of them. And what we can do is we can save that parent prefab, and it'll save all the children as a part of that prefab. So we don't really need to return that game object. I'll leave it in, but we're already able to access those game objects through the parent. So let's just say for each mesh, for each we're going to create a mesh game object with that mesh and with the parent prefab. All right. So now, parent.transform. Now we have a parent prefab with all its children game objects. All we need to do is save that parent prefab. So let's go back into our assets utility class, and we're going to create one more function, and that's going to be our save prefab asset function. Okay, so we have save mesh asset. We'll have a public static void save prefab asset with our string, which are string, which will be our folder path, and also our GameObject, which will be our instance. Oh man, I'm not sure how much to explain here. There's a difference between a prefab and an instance of that prefab. Okay, so if you say, for example, you might be used to in Unity, or when the game starts, or when someone fires a bullet, GameObject.instantiate this prefab. So it's got like the prefab's like the template, and then it creates an instance of it. When you say new GameObject, when we said new GameObject here and new GameObject here, that's creating instances that will die as soon as the program stops running. What we've got to do is create a prefab from that instance and then delete the instance. We don't need it anymore. So let's go ahead and do that. First of all, we'll create the path just like our mesh asset path. So we'll go ahead and you just have instance dot name and it's a dot prefab file. Okay, now let's create our prefab. So GameObject prefab equals prefab utility dot create prefab asset and its path. We're going to pass in the instance, and we're just going to set replace prefab options dot default. Okay, so we've got our prefab. Now we can delete our instance because we don't need that anymore. Okay, so now we say GameObject dot destroy immediate instance. Alrighty, and now in our mesh prefab generator, we can go ahead and save asset utility dot save prefab asset at the folder path. So that's the path that anyone specifies for this scriptable object, and we're going to save our parent prefab, remembering that this parent prefab has all of the mesh prefabs as children of it, so it'll save all of those as well. Okay, let's go ahead and try that out. Oh, of course, one more thing. There's always one more thing. We also need to set the asset menu. So in our star mesh generator, I'll just use the same syntax as this, because remember we're using scriptable objects here. Okay, asset generator, we'll just call it mesh prefab. And two little things that I totally just didn't spend 10 minutes figuring out is that this folder path that I've set here, it's not the right path. It's where you need the star mesh generators folder path, because this is saying get every mesh at the path that you're specifying, and it's the mesh generators path. So we say star mesh generator dot folder path, and for each of those we'll save it to the prefabs folder path. One more little thing, in our asset utility, I was just getting a little warning saying you're not using this prefab variable, so we can remove that as well. Okay, now we can go into our procedural assets folder. We've got our database loader, which is taking that CSV file. We can have a look at those stars, make sure that they're all loaded in. So it's taking our CSV file and then it's saving them as star info. Now we've got our mesh generator taking the star info, saving it as meshes. We can have a look, check that the mesh with 9 verts and 9 triangles saved. And now we're also going to have our prefab generator. So we go Starchart, asset generators, mesh prefab. Let's call it star mesh prefab generator. That's a long name. I'm just going to say star prefab generator. Prefab name, I'll just call it star prefab. Folder path, this is where do you want the prefab to be saved. I'm just going to have it saved at this current path. So I can just say copy path. Control, let's try the shortcut. Control-C, and then paste it. Oh, that's not it. That didn't work. Okay, doesn't matter. Procedural assets. Okay, that'll be the path that the prefab will be saved at. The material isn't going to work because we need to create a special material that knows how to deal with point topology. We'll do that in the next episode. And now we're going to create, now we're just going to link up our star mesh generator so that our prefab generator knows where this meshes folder is. All right, so we'll go ahead and hit generate. Oh, no! I just deleted everything. Oh, that's funny as. Okay, don't do what I just did. I just remembered that when you set that folder, it's going to delete everything inside it. Oh, okay, that's all right. It'll be fast. So I'll create, let's see, this will be good because we can go back through the steps. Create our star database, which we'll need to know about our database path, HYG sample, copy that path, database loader. All right, so our database, that'll know about our database path. We can go ahead and press load. Now we've got our stars. I'm going to rename that to star database, not new star database, okay. Now let's create our mesh generator. Star mesh generator. We'll create a folder for it called meshes. Control-Alt-C to get the path of that. Go ahead and paste that. We're also going to need to drag in our database loader. Hit generate. Make sure we've got a mesh in there. Yep, we've got a mesh in there. And now we're going to create a new folder separately called prefabs. And we're going to create our prefab generator. Mesh prefab generator. Let's call it star prefab generator. Rename that to prefab name of star prefab. Okay, folder path of the prefabs folder. Control-Alt-C or Command-Alt-C. Oh, did I do that right? Oh no, not Control-Alt-V, just Control-V. Okay, and now mesh generator is the mesh generator. A material, yeah, I already discussed that. We hit generate. And there is our star prefab with a child called stars. If we have a look at that star mesh, that'll be the same mesh that's in our meshes folder.